section. To Redhill in fog, the morning after receiving the ominous letter, Holmes rose before dawn, already dressed and sharpening the edge of anticipation with his habitual precision. A thick fog had rolled in during the early hours, blanketing Baker Street in a ghostly pall. From our sitting-room window, the world appeared as a watercolor blurred by a careless hand. Holmes stood before the hearth, clasping a black leather case. He looked as though he had slept not at all, and indeed, I had heard him pacing during the small hours, occasionally striking a single melancholy note on his violin. "You've made your decision, then?" I asked, setting aside my untouched breakfast. "There was never any indecision," Holmes said, turning to me. "We depart within the hour. The train to Redhill departs Victoria Station at 8:45. I've reserved a compartment. And your thoughts on the letter?" I prompted. He picked up the envelope again, now crinkled from repeated readings. "Its phrasing is dramatic, as we noted last night, but not without design. The writer knows me. The appeal to reason, the symbolic tone, this is someone who understands the value I place on inference and language. The seal was bespoke. The raven in flight suggests personal symbolism. The writer likely has a poetic streak or a past steeped in some dark tragedy. You believe it to be a trap? Possibly, but not the crude sort. This is a stage set carefully meant to entice rather than ensnare. The true motive, I suspect, lies somewhere between confession and exhibition. By the time we boarded the train, the morning sun had begun to burn away some of the fog, though it clung stubbornly to the edges of the Thames and wrapped itself about the low-lying roofs like a shawl. Holmes was quiet during the journey, eyes half-lidded, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. I meanwhile turned over the scant information we possessed. An anonymous letter, an abandoned chapel, and the invitation to witness secrets rotting. Under the eyes of a raven, we arrived at the rural station of Redhill just past 10 o'clock. A single porter leaned against the brickwork of the platform, chewing on a stem of grass. No other passengers disembarked. The village itself was no more than a collection of timber-framed homes, a post office, and a smithy. Beyond it, the land, unfurled in soft hills and copse-covered fields. Redhill Chapel lies northeast, just past the old Bishop's Way, Holmes murmured as we set out on foot. It was once the private chapel for the Montgrave estate, long since fallen into ruin. The family line is extinct. A fitting setting for a cryptic warning. I muttered. The chapel soon loomed into view, nestled among yew trees, with bark like weathered stone. Its bell tower leaned slightly to one side, and its stained glass windows were obscured with grime. The wrought iron gate was rusted, but UNCHAINED inside. The chapel was cloaked in a kind of sacred stillness, though the sanctity had long since faded. The air smelled of mildew and damp stone. Pews lay overturned in disarray, and ivy crept through cracks in the floor. Above the altar hung the skeletal remains of a great brass chandelier, its candles long since melted to waxy lumps. Holmes surveyed the room with slow, precise turns of the head, his boots silent against the flagstones. "Observe," he said, kneeling beside a patch of dust near the altar. "Footprints to pairs, one smaller, likely a woman's, both recent." I peered at the faint depressions, but no others entering through the nave. Exactly. which suggests either stealth or secrecy, possibly both. They may have entered through another door. He walked toward the side corridor that led to what once might have been a VESTRY dot. As we pushed open the creaking wooden door, a faint clatter echoed within. Holmes froze. I drew my revolver instinctively, though Holmes raised a hand to still me. The chamber beyond was sparse, lined with crumbling hymnals and rotted drapery. In one corner, a raven sat perched atop an iron candelabra, its black eyes glistening with eerie intelligence. The watchful guardian, Holmes murmured. Dot on the opposite wall. Written in charcoal across crumbling plaster was a verse: "Within these walls, truth is sung by hands long still and hearts once young. Heed the notes that time forgot and find the soul that silence sought." We stood there for a moment, transfixed. Holmes stepped closer, tracing the verse with a gloved finger. "This is no vandal scrawl. The hand is deliberate, precise. It's a clue, but not one to be deciphered quickly." "And the raven?" I asked, still eyeing the bird uneasily. "An omen, if you believe in such things, but more likely a trained creature. Someone has been tending it." As Holmes surveyed the rest of the room, his gaze landed on a small wooden hatch, half hidden beneath a tattered rug. "Watson," he said quietly, "fetch the lantern. We may have just discovered the passage that leads beneath the chapel." "Beneath?" I echoed. "Surely this structure has no crypt?" "Not documented, no. But the Montgrave family were known for their secrets. It would be just like them to build a hidden vault or tunnel. Come." With a final glance toward the motionless raven, we descended into the dark. The steps were slick with moss and cold against our palms. The lantern cast flickering shadows that danced along the stone walls as we descended further and further. Into silence. At last we reached a door. Holmes pressed his ear against the wood. Then, with a breath, he pushed it open. Inside was a room stone-lined, damp and utterly silent. A single wooden chair sat in the center, and upon it, wrapped in oilcloth and string, lay a violin case. Holmes stepped forward, unwrapped the cloth with the reverence of a priest, and revealed a violin unlike any I had seen before. It gleamed darkly in the lantern light with a varnish the color of deep crimson. "This," Holmes whispered, "is no ordinary instrument." And then we heard it. Above us in the chapel. A single note was played, clear, haunting. The violin in Holmes's hands had not moved. We looked at each other, the same thought dawning in our minds. Someone else was in the chapel, and they were playing the same violin? Or was it its twin? Holmes carefully returned the instrument to its resting place and gestured for silence. "The real performance, Watson," he said under his breath, "is just beginning." "Section, the second note," the sound echoed, one lingering, tremulous note, fragile as breath and dissolved into the darkness above our heads. It wasn't merely music, it was a summons. Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable in the shifting lamplight, but I recognized a glint in his eyes, part calculation, part excitement. "No time to linger," he said, adjusting the lamps. Height and taking swift strides back toward the stone stairwell. "Whoever plays above has either been watching us or wishes to be found." The ascent felt longer than our descent. Every scuff of boot on stone, every shifting shadow seemed amplified. Somewhere above, silence had returned, but the air was different now, charged. as though the chapel itself held its breath. We emerged into the chapel's nave, our lantern casting long beams across the now familiar ruin. The raven had gone. The moon, filtering through broken panes, painted the pews in silver and shadow. But the source of the sound remained invisible. No sign of any living soul. Holmes moved with purpose. He approached the altar, pausing before the stained glass window that, when backlit, showed only a flickering mosaic of saints and swords. He studied the space for several seconds, then placed his hand upon the altar rail and pressed down. A click sounded beneath us, subtle but distinct. The floor panel beneath Holmes's foot gave slightly. "A mechanism," he muttered, "ingeniously concealed." Kneeling, he adjusted the lantern to reveal a thin brass lever hidden within a carved oak panel. With a short tug, the floor shifted. Slowly, almost silently, a square trapdoor lifted open by some internal pulley. A scent of damp oak and candle wax drifted upward. Beneath, a narrow passage led beneath the altar. Without hesitation, Holmes entered. I followed. This second passage differed from the crypt below. It was cleaner, more deliberate. Lanterns, freshly extinguished, lined the walls in sconces. The walls were plastered, and faint etchings marked their surface musical notations, as if some mad composer had scrawled inspiration into the very walls. "Holmes," I said, brushing dust from one line. "It's music." "Not just music," he replied. "A composition. These fragments are not random. Look, recurring motifs. This is a puzzle in melody." We moved carefully, absorbing the eerie silence that lay heavy between those walls. After some distance, the passage widened into a vaulted chamber. The floor was tiled with faded mosaic. At its center stood a dais, and atop it a music stand. Empty, Holmes walked to it, eyes narrowed. This was no secret rehearsal hall. It is a sanctum, a shrine. For what? I asked. He looked around the space, now visibly intrigued. A man? A memory? Or a piece of music so important it warranted preservation beyond time? Suddenly, from the corridor behind us, came a whisper of sound. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate. We turned. Emerging from the shadows was a tall figure, cloaked in black, face obscured by a hood. "Do not be alarmed," the voice said, soft and female. "You are meant to be here." Holmes did not flinch. "Then you must be the one who summoned me." The woman stepped forward and removed the hood. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes sharp, but shadowed by grief. She looked to be in her late 40s, yet carried herself with an elegance that defied decay. "My name is Adeline Montgrave," she said, "daughter of the last caretaker of this chapel and guardian of its secret." Holmes tilted his head. The Montgrave line was said to be extinct. "Nearly," she said with a ghost of a smile, "but not entirely. My father saw to that. He died 10 years past, and with him the last of our name in public record. I chose anonymity. To protect this place? I asked to protect him," she said, and gestured toward the walls. We followed her gaze. In one corner of the room stood an oil portrait, half veiled in dust and cobwebs. She drew aside the cloth. The man in the painting was severe in appearance, but soulful in expression, a violinist. Mid-performance, his eyes were deep-set, his hair wild as a tempest. At his feet, a raven perched upon a pedestal. "My brother, Alaric Montgrave," she said. "Composer, genius, and madman. Holmes studied the portrait, and the music on the walls, his final composition. He wrote it here in secret after the world abandoned him. He believed it would save him. From what? I asked, gently from oblivion. She stepped to a chest beside the dais and withdrew a battered leather case. From within, she drew a violin. Its wood was deep red, nearly black in places. Not the same as the one in the crypt below, but kin to it. He crafted it himself, she said. When the world would not hear his music, he played it to the stones, to the shadows. This chapel is his grave and his concert hall. Holmes stepped forward. Then it was you who played above. No, she replied, her voice growing distant. It was him. I shivered. Holmes remained still, thoughtful. Miss Montgrave, do you understand the implications of this deception? He asked gently. To summon me here through riddles and symbols, was it your intention to draw public notice? No, she said, only your understanding. You, more than any man, might hear what lies within the silence. I don't want his music discovered by the world. I want it buried with him. She placed the violin on the stand. He believed. His final sonata could open a door, she said. Not to fame or riches, but to memory, to truth. Holmes turned to her. And you, Miss Montgrave, what do you believe? She closed her eyes. That some songs were never meant to be played, only remembered. There was a long pause. Then Holmes bowed slightly. Then I shall remember. We emerged from the crypt hours later, the sun now setting behind the yew trees. Holmes said little. As we reached the edge of the chapel grounds, the raven returned, perched silently upon the crumbled gate. A guardian indeed, Holmes murmured. That night, back in our lodgings at the village inn, Holmes took out his notebook. On one page, he copied several bars of music from memory fragments of Montgrave's Requiem. Then he closed the book, locked it away, and said, Some mysteries are not solved, Watson. They are heard once and never again. And so began the most haunting case of our long career. Section: The Music Box and the Manuscript. We remained at the small village inn on the edge of Redhill for 2 more days, though Holmes barely seemed present. After our descent into the chapel crypt and our encounter with Adeline Montgrave, something had shifted within him. He smoked more than usual, not from agitation, but from contemplation. I knew that expression well. It was the same taut stillness he displayed before checkmate on the chessboard, or a final blow in a prize fight. There was a puzzle taking shape in his mind. On the morning of the 3rd day, as mist curled across the hedgerows like trailing fingers, I found him hunched over the table in our small parlor, a stack of crumpled manuscript pages strewn before him. More of Montgrave's music? I asked, pouring myself a cup of lukewarm tea. Holmes did not immediately respond. His gaze flicked from page to page, fingers drumming the edge of his chair. The structure is brilliant, he murmured. Fugue layered upon fugue, motifs concealed within harmonic dissonance. But it's not merely music, Watson. You think it's coded? I asked, perching on the edge of the settee. I know it is. He tapped a margin. See this pattern? The notations repeat in cycles of 3, followed by a descending scale. But the sequence doesn't resolve musically. It fractures. I leaned over his shoulder. To my untrained eye, it looked like nothing more than a complex arrangement of notes and sharps, but I had learned long ago to trust Holmes' instincts. "And yet," he said, rising to pace, "why embed a cipher into music known only to a dead man and his sister? Who was meant to discover it? Or was it never meant to be found at all?" A knock at the door interrupted his musings. The innkeeper entered, bowing slightly. "Message arrived for you, Mr. Holmes, left by a boy on a bicycle just after sunrise." Holmes thanked him with a nod and accepted the envelope. He turned it over twice, plain paper, no return name, sealed with red wax. He broke it open and scanned the contents silently. Then he handed it to me. The note read, "You were not the only one listening. Tonight, the bell will toll at 1. Bring the music box. A. I echoed. "Not Adeline Montgrave again?" "No," Holmes said flatly. "Adeline left yesterday at dawn without a word." The innkeeper confirmed it. "Then who?" Holmes moved to his valise and withdrew. The small music box we had found in the chapel, ornate silver inlay with the initials A.M. etched into the base. He had taken it with him quietly, slipping it into his coat after our last meeting with Miss Montgrave. He set it on the table and wound the key. A delicate tune began to play 5 simple notes, repeated in a lullaby's rhythm. But this time, Holmes noticed something different. He leaned down, ear close to the mechanism, then stopped the rotation abruptly. He took his pocket knife and gently pried the base away. A slip of paper fell onto the table. Holmes unfolded it carefully. It was brittle, discolored with age. On it were 4 lines of neatly written verse, "Where silence blooms beneath the nave, and midnight secrets sing. A raven keeps the chapel grave where shadows guard the king." "A riddle," I said. Holmes' smile was faint, almost reluctant. "Indeed, and like all good riddles, it conceals more than it reveals." He set the note down and stood. "Come, Watson. We must pay the chapel another visit." Night had already fallen when we returned to Ravenshill. The moon rode high, shrouded by streaks of thin, fast-moving clouds. The chapel was dark, no lamps, no sound, just the creak of the gate and the restless rustle of the trees. Holmes led the way, lantern in hand, the music box tucked under his coat. Inside, the chapel was colder than before. The silence seemed deeper, more watchful. The raven, curiously, was perched not at the gate this time, but on the beam above the altar, unmoving, its eyes like 2 jet stones catching the lantern light. Holmes turned toward the nave and tapped the floor twice with the end of his walking cane. "Beneath the nave," he murmured, echoing the riddle. "And midnight secrets sing?" He knelt and ran his hands along the flagstones. After a moment, he located a slightly raised stone, a narrow crack beside it suggesting it had been disturbed. With effort, he pried it open. Beneath it, nestled in a shallow alcove, lay a second music box. This one was smaller, carved from black walnut, and bearing no initials. Holmes opened it. No sound emerged. He inspected it, then handed it to me. "This one has no mechanism, merely the shell." Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was another slip of paper. Another stanza, "Where bells have rung but toll no more, the truth begins to bend. What starts with song may end in war, if memory dares to mend." Holmes pocketed the slip and closed the box. "Another trail. This one leads us higher. To the bell tower?" I asked, glancing upward. "Precisely." We ascended the spiral stair again. Wind howled through broken slats in the stonework. At the top, the great iron bell hung silent as ever. But now Holmes noted something different, a set of faint scuff marks on the boards near the rope pulley. Recent activity. He raised the lantern and held it near the interior of the bell. There, he said. See it? Inside the bells. Hollow chamber, etched into the metal, was an inscription. A single word, requiem. It was a message, Holmes murmured. Left not only in verse and wood, but in iron. He turned to me. This is no longer merely about music or memory, Watson. Someone is constructing a narrative through riddles, through rituals. But why? We stood in silence as the wind stirred around us, and then, faintly from below, the sound of a violin, once more slow, plaintive. Someone was playing, and the nave. Holmes was already moving, lantern swinging. We raced down the spiral, steps into the chapel once more. At the altar, a figure stood hooded again, though this time smaller, slighter. They'd played a single sustained note, then ceased. Back in the village, Holmes stopped at the rectory. The vicar, Reverend Porter, met us at the gate, wiping his hands on a gardening cloth. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, a surprise to see you so soon. We seek a parish ledger, Reverend, Holmes said without preamble. From the 1890s, particularly around the time of Mrs. Montgrave's passing. Porter looked puzzled, but nodded. Come in, come in. The old ledgers are in the vestry. He led us through the tidy rectory and into a small room thick with the scent of must and beeswax. A stack of tomes sat in a locked cabinet, which he opened with a brass key. Holmes flipped through the thick leather-bound volumes with rapid precision until he reached the year 1893. There, he said, tapping a line, March 3rd, 1893, burial of Arabella Montgrave, interred with sealed box per husband's request. Witnessed by V. Ashcroft. Sealed box? I echoed. Exactly, Holmes said. A burial with more than just the deceased. And Ashcroft, a name we saw earlier, did we not? I nodded slowly. The letter this morning. Signed Ashcroft. Holmes snapped the book shut. The plot thickens, Watson. It seems the past is not merely whispering, it is singing. Do you think Ashcroft still lives? If he does, we must find him. His knowledge may complete the melody, both literal and metaphorical. He turned to Reverend Porter. Is there a Mr. Ashcroft still residing in the parish? Porter frowned. Victor Ashcroft? He's quite reclusive these days. Lives in a cottage just past the West Mill. Lost his hearing years ago, poor man, but he was once quite close to the Montgraves. Thank you, Reverend, Holmes said with a nod. We shall pay him a visit this afternoon. We arrived at Ashcroft's cottage as the sun began to sink behind the hills. The air carried the scent of burning peat, and a curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney. Holmes knocked briskly. The door opened slowly. A thin man in his 70s peered out, eyes sharp but lined with years. Victor Ashcroft? Holmes asked, raising his voice slightly. The man nodded. We have questions about the Montgrave family, particularly a sealed box buried with Arabella. Ashcroft's eyes flickered. Without a word, he opened the door wide and gestured us in. The Ashcroft's eyes flickered. Without a word, he opened the door wide and gestured us in. The was in the open. The door was cottage was sparse but clean fire crackling. a clock ticking steadily on the mantel. Ashcroft retrieved a writing slate and chalk from a nearby shelf and scribbled, "I knew Gideon." I kept his final secret. Until now he handed the slate to Holmes. Holmes nodded gravely. What was in the box? Ashcroft hesitated, then opened a small cabinet beneath the hearth and pulled out a flat wooden case. Holmes opened it slowly. Inside was a leather-bound manuscript, tied with ribbon, Montgrave's final composition, The Raven's Requiem. Holmes held it like one might hold a sacred relic. Ashcroft scribbled again. He said the music would awaken the truth. He made me promise never to let it fall into the wrong hands. Holmes looked up, his face unreadable. It already has. We departed with the manuscript, Holmes holding it carefully as we walked back through the growing dusk. "This," he said, quietly, "is the key to everything, and someone will do anything to keep it buried." Section: The Manuscript and the Madrigal. The following morning dawned gray and wind-brushed, as if the very sky were holding its breath. A sullen drizzle misted the panes of our chamber at the Redhill Arms, and Holmes, wrapped in his greatcoat, sat hunched before the hearth. Montgrave's final manuscript spread open across the tea table, like a cartographer's map of a forgotten world. It was a curious thing bound in oxblood leather, the corners burnished by time and handling, its pages inscribed in a fine, obsessive hand. I glanced over Holmes' shoulder as he examined the notations with a severity one usually reserved for ciphers or the finer prints of a contract. "Is it complete?" I asked quietly, sipping the scalding tea the innkeeper had brought moments before. "No," Holmes said, tapping the edge of a measure with his finger. "See here, this bar ends unresolved, hanging off the stave like a question unanswered. And again, here another passage abruptly broken mid-phrase." I leaned closer, squinting. "So it is unfinished?" "Deliberately so," Holmes murmured. "This is not the result of a composer lost in thought. This is a man interrupted." He reached for a small notebook and began scribbling furiously. "Listen, Watson. This movement here, marked andante, follows an exact pattern of triplets echoing the dies irae motif, commonly associated with requiems." "A funeral mass," I said, brows raised. "Indeed. But more than that. It is transposed not in a minor key, but in a haunting G major, a contradiction of tone, grief, and joy's clothing." He closed the manuscript and stared into the fire. Montgrave was mourning, but not, I believe, merely his wife. We sat in silence a moment as the wind howled against the window. Then Holmes stood abruptly, pacing. "I believe this manuscript is a key, both literal and symbolic. These unfinished phrases may contain more than melody. A cipher, perhaps. The final notes may well lead to something more ... concrete." A knock sounded at the door. I answered to find the vicar, Reverend Porter, holding his hat in his hands, and looking grave. "I beg pardon for the intrusion, gentlemen," he said, "but something rather disturbing has occurred." Holmes stepped forward. "What has happened?" Porter hesitated. "Victor Ashcroft's cottage was broken into last night." Holmes stiffened. "Was he harmed?" "No. Thankfully, he is uninjured, shaken. Of course, he cannot hear, so the intruder may not have realized he was even there. But the place was ransacked, papers thrown, drawers overturned. Ashcroft found it this morning." "Did he report it to the constable?" "He came directly to me. You see, nothing was taken. At least, not that he can tell." But he wanted you to know. Holmes grabbed his coat and gestured for me to follow. Then we must go at once. Ashcroft stood in the doorway of his ravaged cottage, his face pale but composed. He led us inside, pointing to the overturned desk, the scattered books, the broken ink bottle staining a corner of the rug like a dried wound. Holmes examined the scene with his usual scrutiny. The intruder searched hastily, but not without intent. See here. Watson, only the cabinet beneath the hearth remains untouched, the one where the manuscript was stored. I nodded. They were looking for it. Holmes knelt beside the hearth, running his gloved fingers along the cabinet door. Curious. No signs of force. They either didn't know about the cabinet or assumed it had already been emptied. Ashcroft, notebook in hand, scribbled and handed the message to Holmes. I told no one where I kept it. Only you. Holmes nodded gravely. Then the danger increases. We are not dealing with an opportunist, but someone informed, someone who knows what this music might represent. Ashcroft underlined his response and added, Montgrave feared it, said it contained a truth no man should own. That's why he buried it. Holmes looked up. And yet someone would kill for it. Returning to the inn, Holmes remained tight-lipped, his long fingers drumming across the manuscript's spine as we walked. Watson, I must ask you to do something. Of course. I need you to return to the chapel alone. Examine every stone near the pulpit, especially beneath the choir stalls. Look for anything that might conceal a compartment or cache. Take care. I suspect we are being followed. And you? I must send a telegram to Mycroft. The wider implications of this may warrant ministry interest. There may be more, too. This than even we suspected. Holmes. But he was already turning down the lane toward the post office. I arrived at Redhill Chapel to find it quiet once more, the door left ajar in defiance of its usual creak. A shaft of pale morning. Light filtered through the rose window, casting hues of ruby and gold upon the flagstones. I moved toward the choir stalls, my footsteps echoing through the nave, and knelt beside the first row feeling along the base. I detected nothing unusual until I reached the far end. There my fingers found a hollow thud. I pried gently at the edge and discovered a loose tile, beneath which lay a small velvet-lined box. Inside, another music box identical in shape to the others, but this one bearing the initials GM carved into its silver lid. I opened it. The melody was unfamiliar slow, meandering, almost hesitant. But as it played, I realized it was the missing phrase from Montgrave's manuscript. The final measure. The last note. Footsteps behind me. I turned, startled, and found myself facing a woman cloaked in gray. She lowered her hood. Eliza Bellamy. I gasped. Her face was pale, her dark hair streaked with silver. The same woman. From the graveyard of that I was certain. You have it, she said softly. The final melody. I stood, instinctively placing the music box behind me. Why are you here? To finish what was begun, she said. To ensure it ends where it should. Miss Bellamy, if that is your name, we have reason to believe someone is pursuing this for less noble purposes. She nodded slowly. I know, but they do not understand. This music, it is not treasure. It is truth. Truth. She stepped closer. Montgrave composed it for his wife, but within it lies more than grief. He encoded something. A confession, perhaps a revelation. I believe it points to something hidden beneath this chapel, a chamber, a vault. But only the full composition will reveal the entrance. At that moment the bell tolled once deep, low, and unexpected. We both looked upward. "Holmes," I whispered, then, without another word, Eliza turned and fled into the shadows of the transept. I did not follow. I cradled the music box and made my way back to Baker Street. The storm, I knew, was just beginning. Section. Whispers beneath the choir. It was dusk by the time I returned to Baker Street, weary from my expedition to the chapel, and inside was not a body, but a collection of scrolls sealed and bound in oilskin, and beneath them a wooden case. Holmes lifted the case and opened it. Inside, a set of architectural plans, maps, and a series of correspondences. At the top lay a letter, yellowed with age, but marked with a wax seal bearing Montgrave's initials. Holmes unfolded it carefully and read aloud. "To whomever finds this, you stand at the heart of a secret born by grief and preserved by love. What lies here is the record of an order lost to time, the Cantorus Obscura, a fellowship of musicians, architects, and philosophers who believed in preserving knowledge, not through ink or stone, but sound. This chapel, this vault, is one such repository. The final melody, the Requiem in G, contains the coordinates to all remaining sanctuaries. But beware, knowledge is a gift and a curse. Guard it well. Montgrave," I stared at Holmes. "A secret. Society?" He nodded. "And Montgrave was its last guardian. That's why he buried the truth in music, because only those who could read it properly would ever find it." I stepped back, overwhelmed. But why would someone want to destroy this or kill for it? Because knowledge is power, Watson. And there are those who would weaponize even the beauty of sound for their own ends. We sealed the vault again before dawn, taking only the letter and the scrolls with us. Back in Baker Street, Holmes packed the documents into a locked case and sent it by private courier to his brother Mycroft, with explicit instructions for its preservation. "I trust no one else with this," he told me. "And Eliza Bellamy?" I asked. "She will come again," he said. "They all do in the end." As the sun rose, we sat in silence. The chapel was quiet once more, but beneath it, secrets slept, and above the raven still watched. Section. A shadow from the east window. The morning after our return from the subterranean vault beneath Redhill Chapel dawned with a stillness that felt artificial, like a held breath before the shattering of glass. I awoke later than usual to find Holmes already dressed and at the window, pipe in hand, his gaze distant and grave. "I presume you've slept," he remarked without turning. "More or less," I replied, stretching the stiffness from my joints. "Though I can't say it was restful. I keep hearing that melody in my sleep, the Requiem in G. Music has memory, Watson," he said, still watching the gray street below, "especially when played in sacred places." I stood and poured myself tea, the silence between us filled with the soft clink of china and the muffled clip-clop of hooves outside. Holmes remained contemplative. "We weren't alone down there," he said finally. I lowered the cup. "What do you mean?" He turned to face me, eyes sharp. "Someone tampered with the ossuary lock between the time I visited and our descent last night. The hidden stairwell had been exposed only partially, but enough to suggest someone else had begun. To uncover it. But who? And why wait until now to act? He tapped his fingers on the windowsill. That's what troubles me. Whoever it is, they're familiar with the Cantoris Obscura. Likely more than we are. The scrolls and plans we recovered are only fragments. The true treasure was knowledge, ancient, obscure, perhaps even dangerous. And now someone else knows it exists, he nodded, which means the game is afoot once more. We received our next piece of the puzzle, not in the form of a visitor, but a package delivered anonymously that afternoon by a thin boy in a page's cap. Holmes opened it carefully, revealing a single object inside, a stained glass shard, roughly triangular and no larger than a coin. Embedded within it, etched so finely it would scarcely be seen without a magnifying glass, were Latin characters, lux et veritas redemptio. Light and truth redemption, Holmes translated aloud, the motto of the Montgrave lineage, and by extension, the Cantoris Obscura. Where could it have come from? I asked. He stepped to the bureau and retrieved a roll of parchment, one of the chapel's original architectural plans. The eastern rose window, he said, laying the scroll out. It was shattered decades ago and replaced with simpler tracery. But Montgrave's original design included an intricate center panel bearing that exact phrase. I leaned over the scroll. You think someone took a fragment from that window and sent it to us as a message or a warning? We wasted no time. Within the hour, we were back at Redhill Chapel. This time, the chapel felt wrong. The air was heavier, as though the ancient stones themselves strained under the weight of secrets kept too long. As we crossed the threshold, the light that filtered through the high stained glass windows was bruised and watery. Holmes walked, slowly inspecting the walls, the floorboards, even the corners where cobwebs gathered like gossip. He paused at the eastern wall, where the reconstructed window stood. One panel was indeed newer than the rest, its colors less weathered. Holmes turned to me. This wall hides something. He stepped back, eyes narrowing as he scrutinized the base of the window. Then, with deliberate care, he pressed against. The lower sill dot, there was a soft click. A portion of the wall creaked open, revealing a narrow, dust-laden passage, barely wide enough for a man to pass through. Good Lord, I whispered. Another hidden space? It appears Montgrave was more paranoid than we imagined. We stepped inside, lanterns lifted. The passage wound for several yards, the stone walls damp and close. At last it opened into a small, round chamber, perhaps an old sacristy or a monk's refuge. Within sat a solitary lectern, and on it a book bound in deep crimson leather, and chained to the pedestal. Holmes leaned in. This is no ordinary volume. He opened it gently. The parchment inside was handwritten in dense Latin, with musical notation and illuminated margins that glittered with gold leaf. It's a grimoire, he breathed, a codex of the Cantoris Obscura. This may be the only complete record of their rites, teachings, and Watson. Look here. He pointed to a series of musical motifs unfamiliar to me, yet clearly deliberate. Next to them were diagrams of resonance chambers, bell harmonics, even instructions for constructing specific architectural structures. This is more than theology, Holmes said. It's a science of sound. The Cantoris believed certain frequencies, when amplified within sacred geometry, could influence the human mind. I felt a chill. Hypnosis? Control? or perhaps enlightenment. But whatever their purpose, it was powerful enough to hide and dangerous enough to destroy. Suddenly a sound from behind Dot. We turned. A figure blocked the passage cloaked in black, the hood drawn low over the face. Holmes did not flinch. "You've been following us since the ossuary," he said calmly. The figure remained silent. "What is it you want?" Holmes continued. "The knowledge? The grimoire? Or merely to ensure that it remains buried?" Still silence. Then the voice came rasping, female, familiar. "Eliza Bellamy is dead," the figure said. "But her task is not finished." I stepped forward. You were the woman at the chapel." She removed the hood. It was her, but changed. Thinner, paler, as though the secrets had fed on her more than she on them. "I was Montgrave's final pupil," she said. "He taught me to listen between the notes, to find meaning where silence dwells." Holmes was impassive. "You sent the glass?" "I wanted to see if you were worthy." "Of what?" She pointed to the book. "Of guarding the last truth, that which cannot be published, nor spoken, nor played aloud, for it reshapes those who hear it." Holmes closed the book. "And if we refuse?" She stepped forward. "Then it will fall into other hands, hands that care not for harmony, but for control." Holmes regarded her for a long time. Then he handed her the book. "You were never a thief," he said, "only a custodian." She took the grimoire and nodded, tears glinting in her eyes. "Then let the music remain forgotten." With that, she turned and vanished into the shadows. We left the chapel in silence, not defeated, not victorious, but changed. Later that evening, Holmes sat by the fire, eyes closed, violin on his knee. "But he did not play. There are melodies, Watson," he said, "meant never to be heard, only remembered." And in the quiet that followed, I understood. The raven of Redhill Chapel had spoken, and we had listened. Section. Echoes beneath the raven's cry. A pallid dawn greeted us at Redhill the morning after the fire. At the conservatoire, the sky seemed to lean low, burdened by moisture, and the chapel stood before us like a silent sentinel. Its yawning windows and traceless stonework gave no hint of the storm brewing beneath. Holmes and I disembarked at the gravel path, our boots stirring a brittle echo in the stillness. Holmes paused at the chapel's entrance and drew a brisk breath that tasted of iron and damp. "There is something different today," he observed. Glancing over his shoulder, the trees that bordered the grounds stood dark as sentinels. A lone raven perched atop a stone cross near the porch, tilting its head as though measuring our approach. The bird's presence, unsettling in its precision, silenced me more effectively than any mist. It turned from us, cawed once, and flapped into the creeping fog as though beckoning us forward. We entered beneath the low arch of the porch. The chapel's interior was unchanged since we last saw it. Dust motes drifting in silver beams of morning light, a lingering chill clawing at the skin, and that subdued hush which spoke of abandoned prayer and suppressed secrets. But beneath, the serene facade lay tension, like corded ropes pulling the stones downward. Holmes's bullseye lantern illuminated the nave as he silently strode forward. He halted near the altar and ran his gloved fingers across the carved wood. His jaw set. "They've been here," he murmured, "more recently than I expected." Section. Beneath the hollow choir the following day, Holmes and I returned to Redhill, this time bearing not only a deeper knowledge of the strange, a fair but also an unshakable sense that we were nearing the edge of a precipice. The morning mists clung low over the countryside, and the old road leading to the chapel seemed more sinister under the one light. Holmes had remained uncharacteristically silent throughout the journey, his sharp features fixed in contemplation. He had not even touched his pipe, a sure sign that his thoughts were occupied with threads only he could see. I refrained from disturbing him, content to watch the frost creep along the windows of the carriage and allow my own mind to sift through the puzzle we'd been presented. The chapel loomed ahead like a mournful sentinel. Reverend Ambrose was waiting near the door, wrapped in his long wool coat and visibly more agitated than we had seen him before. A tremor ran through his fingers as he removed his hat. "You must see it," he said without preamble. "The vestry. Something happened last night." "Was it the raven again?" I asked. "No. Worse." He led us through the chapel, whose nave echoed faintly with the sound of our boots. Dust motes swirled in the filtered sunlight that slanted through the stained glass windows. The gloom within seemed deeper than usual, as if the building itself recoiled from what had transpired. In the vestry, a small chamber adjoining the main hall, the scent of damp stone and candle wax mingled with a faint metallic tang. There, laid carefully upon the wooden table, was a long, torn piece of choir robe, its hem burned, the fabric marked with dark crimson stains. Holmes bent to examine it. "This was left deliberately," he said, "not discarded in haste. The burn marks. Watson, take a look here." I moved closer, and he pointed to the edge of the scorch several small puncture marks, like pinpricks in the shape of a triangle. "A ceremonial dagger, perhaps," Holmes murmured, "or something designed to draw attention while leaving little true harm." Ambrose wrung his hands. "It was laid there some time after I left for my evening prayers. I locked the vestry myself. This morning the door was unbolted. Then someone within the parish has a key or knows how to manipulate the locks," Holmes said, rising. "This is no mere haunting, Reverend. It is theater, and quite an elaborate one." As we stepped back into the main chapel, Holmes stopped abruptly at the transept, eyes narrowing on a pattern of dust along the flagstones. "These tracks, Watson. Note the disturbance here. A person of small stature, perhaps a woman, and recently." He dropped to one knee and used his lens to inspect a strand of hair caught in a splinter on the pew. "Blonde, delicate." "Elspeth," I said quietly. Holmes said nothing, but the shadow in his eyes deepened. Ambrose's face was pale. "You think she's involved?" Holmes replied. "Involved, yes. Willingly, that remains to be seen." He moved quickly now, crossing to the northern wall of the chapel where a narrow door lay partly ajar. It led to the crypts beneath the ancestral resting place of the Redhill patrons and the more recent burial of Henry Belgrave. Holmes descended the stairs 2 at a time, lantern in hand. The air below was heavy with earth and stone, the chill of death lingering in the silence. I followed more cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck bristling. The crypts stretched into darkness, flanked by niches and tombs. Holmes paused before a sealed stone slab, inscribed with the Belgrave crest, a raven with outspread wings perched atop a crown of laurels. He examined the slab carefully, then ran his fingers along the edges. "This has been disturbed recently. The mortar is loose. With effort, we shifted the slab aside. Inside lay the coffin of Henry Belgrave, its lid askew. Holmes lifted it. To our shock, the coffin was empty. What madness is this? I gasped. Holmes scanned the interior with his lens. No traces of decomposition. Either he was never buried here or he was removed. Recently, Ambrose was trembling. That cannot be. I conducted the service myself. Then either your service was for an empty box, Holmes said gravely, or someone has dared to commit sacrilege in the name of concealment. A flutter of movement drew our attention. From the far end of the crypt, a figure stepped forward, -ELSPETH. She held a small oil lamp and looked pale, but resolute. I thought you might come, she said. Miss Ambrose, Holmes said, voice like flint, you have some explaining to do. Her eyes flicked between us. You must understand none of this is what it seems. My uncle knew. He was part of it. Part of what? She came closer, eyes glistening. The Order of the Raven, a secret society tied to Redhill's old nobility. They claimed to protect sacred knowledge rituals, ancient music said to awaken the spirit. Henry was their last true patron, but it grew darker, more obsessed. He spoke of summoning, communion with something beneath. She shuddered. The music was part of it. A lost hymn composed by the founder of Redhill Chapel. When played with the right notes, strange things happened. Was the hymn played at his funeral? Holmes asked. She nodded. And something changed. The nights grew colder. I heard footsteps in the chapel long after the doors were locked. And then the dreams. She trailed off, visibly shaken. Holmes took a deep breath. Where is the hymn now? She reached into her cloak and pulled out a scroll old parchment, sealed in wax. I took it from the chapel archives. If they play it again at the solstice, they believe they can bring him back. But they're wrong. This isn't resurrection, it's possession. We stared at her, stunned. Holmes took the scroll and examined the notes. His brow furrowed. Watson, we are dealing with no mere superstition. The structure here is deliberate, mathematically precise. There's a cipher embedded in the score. A message, perhaps, or an instruction. From above, the chapel bell began to toll noon. Holmes snapped the scroll shut. We must leave. Tonight we return with the constabulary, and this hymn shall remain unplayed. As we emerged into the daylight, I glanced back at the chapel. The stained glass raven in the window seemed darker somehow, its wings outstretched, not in benediction, but in warning. The music had been silenced for now, but the echoes of the Raven of Redhill were far from finished. Section. The choir of the damned. We returned to London that evening. Though Holmes scarcely acknowledged the city's gas-lit streets as they slid past our carriage window. The scroll Elspeth had handed him was cradled in his hands like a relic unearthed from ancient times. He studied it intently, barely blinking. Once or twice he murmured beneath his breath, eyes darting from the musical notation to some unseen ledger in his mind. I, too, was troubled. The sight of Henry Belgrave's desecrated crypt lingered in my thoughts, as did the raw terror in Elspeth's voice. What had begun as a case of missing persons and spectral sightings had turned into something else entirely, something shadowed by secrets older than the chapel itself. Back at Baker Street, Holmes did not eat, nor did he speak. He set the scroll. On the desk beneath his microscope, opened several reference volumes, ancient tomes of liturgical music, geometry, and semiotic theory, and slipped into one of his most intense fugue states. I left him to it, knowing better than to intrude upon that rarest of alchemies. Holmes in communion with a puzzle he had not yet cracked. It was not until morning that he emerged from his trance. "Watson," he said without preamble, "this score is not merely music. It is a lattice." "A what?" "A lattice of sound," he clarified, tapping a finger on the scroll. "A carefully measured sequence of frequencies, arranged not only to form a hymn, but to trigger architectural resonance. This entire affair, Belgrave's burial, the ravings about possession, the order of the raven, it all pivots on sound. The Redhill Chapel is no ordinary structure. It is a resonating chamber." I must have looked as bewildered as I felt, for Holmes leaned forward, eyes glittering. "Consider this," he said. "What if the chapel was constructed not just for worship, but as an instrument? An acoustic vessel designed to enhance or manipulate sound in very precise ways?" I frowned. "You're suggesting the order believed they could use music to summon something?" "No, Watson. I'm suggesting they may have succeeded." He let that pronouncement linger, as ominous as thunder. "But surely you don't believe—" "Believe," Holmes interrupted, "that someone at Redhill has used this mythos, this hymn, to manipulate events to their advantage. And now, with Henry Belgrave's body missing and the scroll in our possession, they're growing desperate." A knock sounded at the door. It was Inspector Gregson, looking harried and flushed. "You'll want to see this," he said, handing Holmes a telegram. "Came in from Redhill this morning." Holmes opened it. His face tightened. "Wentworth dead. Body found at chapel. Cause unknown. Autopsy inconclusive." Ambrosians exhaled slowly. "Another death. Who is Wentworth?" I asked. "The caretaker," Holmes replied. "He kept the chapel grounds. I spoke to him briefly when we first visited. Quiet man. Knew the place inside and out." Gregson stepped in further. "There's more. Ambrose claims the man was found in the nave, flat on his back, eyes wide open. No signs of struggle, no injuries, only this." He produced a photograph. The image was sepia-toned and grainy, but the detail was chilling. Around Wentworth's eyes there were faint, concentric bruises, as though he had been struck by intense pressure from within. "Sound-induced trauma?" I suggested. "Possible," Holmes said. "There are precedence organ ruptures during sonic experiments, for instance. But in a stone chapel like Redhill, it would require a precise sequence played at extreme volume." Holmes's voice was low and urgent. "Then we have only hours. Elspeth, you must come with us. This ritual ends tonight." She nodded, and we departed the chapel beneath a sky already shrouded in clouds. Back in our lodgings, Holmes spread the hymn across the table one last time. He circled symbols, measured intervals, and traced the cipher embedded within the notes. At last he looked up. "Watson, I have it. The true purpose of the hymn. It is not resurrection, it is revelation. Hidden within the chords is a confession." "A confession?" I asked. "Of the crime itself, Henry Belgrave's murder. It was no illness that took him. He was silenced because he intended to dismantle the order. And who silenced him?" Holmes turned toward the window where Redhill's chapel spire pierced the horizon. "I suspect," he said, "that answer awaits us beneath the bell tower at midnight." And so we prepared for the final confrontation. and the final movement of a song no man should have heard. Section. The Raven's Confession. Clock in our lodgings struck 11 as Holmes finished his final calculations. With one hand on his violin and the other on a piece of tracing paper marked with musical intervals, he appeared less like a consulting detective and more like a conductor preparing for a requiem. "Watson," he said without turning from the table, "I require 3 items before midnight: your revolver, a lantern with a red filter, and the small tuning fork in the bottom drawer of my desk." I fetched them promptly, though I could not hide my growing unease. "You anticipate danger," I said. "I anticipate truth," he corrected. "And truth, as you know, is rarely gentle." As we made our way toward Redhill once more, the night had settled into a strange hush. No carriages moved along the road. The hedgerows were still, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Elspeth walked between us, cloaked in silence. She wore a dark shawl over her shoulders, and carried with her the scroll of the Raven hymn, now tightly rolled and tied in crimson ribbon. Her fingers trembled as she clutched it, but she walked without hesitation. The gates to the chapel were open. No constables greeted us. No lamps lit the path. Only the moon illuminated the stones of the path, glinting like bone beneath a black sky. Holmes paused outside the doors. "They've dismissed the guards, or lured them away," I muttered. Inside, the chapel had been transformed. Dozens of candles lined the nave and flickered along the edges of the pews. The altar had been cleared, and at its foot stood a man cloaked in priestly vestments of an unfamiliar cut, long, raven-black robes that shimmered with embroidered symbols. "Father Ambrose," Holmes said softly. The priest turned, his face gaunt and pale. His eyes held a strange, feverish gleam. One, not of madness, but of certainty. "You're just in time," he said. "The hymn is ready. The choir awaits." "There is no choir," Elspeth said, stepping forward. "Only your delusion." "No," Ambrose said, lifting his hands. "The faithful always return." He pointed to the rear pews, and only then did I notice them. Men and women, a dozen at least, all seated in deathly silence. Their eyes were closed, their heads bowed. Some wore simple mourning garb. Others had the unmistakable robes of the order. "Are they alive?" I whispered. Holmes stepped forward cautiously. "Trance, induced by prolonged exposure to tonal resonance, likely from the tuning fork embedded in the chapel's foundation." Ambrose smiled. "They await the awakening. With the hymn, they shall hear what lies beyond." "You've used the hymn to manipulate them," Holmes said. "As you did with Elspeth and Wentworth." Ambrose's expression flickered. "Wentworth was weak. He tried to stop the ritual. He died before the first verse. You killed him. I released him." Holmes's jaw tightened. "Where is Henry Belgrave?" Ambrose lifted the scroll from Elspeth's hands with surprising gentleness. "He rests beneath the bell tower. His voice is the final note." Holmes drew closer. "You had no authority to bury him there." Ambrose's voice dropped. "He was our founder. The hymn was his creation. It is only right that he guide us through the veil." "I don't suppose," Holmes said, "you would permit us to see the burial site?" Ambrose gestured toward the back of the chapel. A stone staircase, narrow and newly revealed beneath the altar, led downward into darkness. Without waiting, Holmes descended. I followed, revolver in hand. The air grew colder with each step, and the sound of dripping water echoed off the stone. At the bottom lay a chamber barely large enough to stand in. A slab of limestone had been set into the floor. Carved upon it was a raven. Holmes knelt. "This is no ordinary grave." He brushed dust from the sides, and beneath the slab was a brass mechanism, a resonating plate, marked with the same musical etchings as the hymn. "The final verse must be played here," Holmes muttered, "and not on an instrument, but in echo." From above came a sound, the beginning of the hymn, chanted in solemn tones by Ambrose. "We must stop him," I said. Holmes rose swiftly. "No, we must let him finish. But only once." He pulled the tuning fork from his pocket and struck it gently against the stone wall. A low hum filled the chamber, causing the mechanism to vibrate faintly. "The key," he said, "is not to silence the hymn, but to complete it with the missing measure, the one Henry Belgrave removed from the scroll before his death." "And you've deduced it?" "Correct." Holmes retrieved a small sheet of parchment from his coat, a hand-scribed musical phrase, "We must return above," quickly. As we emerged from the crypt, Ambrose was in the pulpit, chanting louder now. The congregation remained still, eyes closed, breathing in unison. A strange, shimmering vibration ran through the very air. Holmes turned to Elspeth. "Take your place at the altar. Prepare to sing. When I nod, you must perform this final measure, no more, no less." Elspeth trembled. I don't know if I can." "You must," Holmes said. "It is the key to severing the trance. The false hymn is incomplete. This completes it with truth." She nodded and stepped to the altar. Ambrose noticed the shift. "No," he cried. "The sacred rhythm must not be broken." He leapt from the pulpit, but Holmes stepped between them. "It ends tonight," Holmes said. Ambrose swung wildly, but I intervened, tackling the priest to the floor. "Now, Elspeth," Holmes cried. She opened her mouth and sang. The note was clear, unadorned, and pure. It rose above the dark melody, pierced the thrumming chords like a sunbeam through storm clouds. The change was instant. The vibration ceased. The followers stirred, blinking as though waking from a dream. One by one they looked around in confusion, then collapsed, unharmed but exhausted. Ambrose struggled beneath my grasp, then fell limp. The silence that followed was absolute. Holmes crossed to the pulpit and picked up the scroll. "A raven. Hymn is finished," he said. "But what will become of them?" I asked. "They will recover," Holmes said. The effect was psychosomatic, reinforced by belief and acoustic suggestion. Now that the final measure has broken the illusion, the spell is undone. I looked down at Ambrose. "And him?" Holmes met my gaze. "He will answer for what he has done, not in mystic courts, but in criminal ones." Outside, dawn was breaking. Redhill Chapel stood silent, its shadows dispelled. As we left, Holmes paused to look once more at the bell tower. "Watson," he said, "when superstition dresses in the garb of science, it is no less dangerous. But it can be defeated, not with fear, but with reason." I nodded, watching the rising sun catch the raven weathervane atop the spire. "One mystery remains," I said. "Why did Belgrave compose the hymn in the first place?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Because even the wise can be tempted by the unknown." He said nothing more as we walked on, the case resolved, but the echoes of its music still lingering in the corners of memory. section, a note that lingered, expanded to 1,600 plus words. The next morning unfolded under a gray and sullen sky, as if the heavens themselves had been burdened by the shadows of Redhill Chapel. Rain drizzled in a slow, persistent veil across the window panes of 221 B. Baker Street, drawing wandering rivulets like the tentative hand of memory, tracing its way through glass. I had risen early, unable to shake the echo of the night before the final tolling of the bell, Elspeth Belgrave's voice soaring through the nave, and the soundless shatter of Ambrose's illusions, collapsing like stained glass. Underfoot Holmes sat in his armchair in studied stillness. His pipe, which normally plumed with rhythmic ceremony, remained cold and idle on the table beside him. He stared through the rain-speckled window, his hands steepled under his chin, his eyes fixed on a thought only he could see. The fire crackled. In the grate, the only sound in a room heavy with unspoken conclusions, I sipped my tea and watched him for a time. Holmes was rarely shaken, and never without aim. But today he seemed suspended, neither pleased nor discontented, simply distant, as though replaying the case not for pride, but for resonance. "You've scarcely said a word since we left Redhill," I offered gently. "You're not often so quiet after a successful conclusion." He blinked slowly, as if returning from some mental promenade, and reached for an envelope resting on the mantel. It bore no address, no stamp, only a violet wax seal in the shape of a treble clef. He turned it over once in his hand, then passed it to me without a word. "Elspeth?" I asked. He inclined his head. I broke the seal and unfolded the thick parchment inside. The handwriting was delicate and slanted, the ink smudged in places by a trembling hand or perhaps a tear dot. "My dear Mr. Holmes, you asked me once why Henry wrote the Raven hymn. I told you I did not know. That was a lie, not out of malice, but shame. I feared to speak the truth. Not as Ambrose believed, not to summon them, but to be heard by them. When our son died, Henry lost more than joy. He lost language. He was a man of science, yes, but also of immense feeling. Music became his bridge across the void. And when others responded to his compositions in ways he hadn't intended, with devotion, obsession, reverence, he began to see both the danger and the promise in sound. Ambrose saw only the power. The chapel became his theater. He twisted Henry's work into liturgy, and when Henry tried to take it back, it was too late. The melody had passed beyond him. Ambrose owned the chorus. Henry fell into silence. I knew I had to end it. That is why I reached out to you, and why I returned one last time to sing. But it is done now. The bell has tolled. The hymn has ended. Leave London for good. Yours in quiet truth, E.B. I looked up from the letter slowly. The fire hissed as a log split, its embers flaring briefly like the heartbeat of a story already receding into memory. "She was never a criminal," I said softly. "She was what? A guardian?" Holmes stirred, rising from his chair and folding, his hands behind his back as he walked to the fireplace. "A witness," he said, "to a grief too vast for words, and to a genius misused. A guardian, yes, but also a mourner. She kept her silence not from guilt but reverence." "And Ambrose?" "Committed to an institution this morning," Holmes said. "He was not mad in the traditional sense, merely consumed by a belief he mistook for clarity. His followers have dispersed." No charges will be filed. And Lestrade? Holmes gave a rare smile. He asked if I'd laced the incense with opium. I told him he should learn to listen to music with more care. He crossed the room to his violin and ran a finger along its polished body. For a moment, I thought he might play. Instead, he held it in silence, as though waiting for the right note to rise of its own accord. "It is remarkable," I said, "how so much violence could emerge from something as intangible as a song." Holmes shook his head. "Not violence, Watson. Vulnerability. Ambrose exploited the ache in others, yes. But it began as an act of love. Henry Belgrave did not compose for control. He composed to connect. It was only when others repurposed that bridge for their own ambitions that it turned to ruin." He set the violin down. "Music is the purest form of truth and the most dangerous. It does not lie, but it is easily misunderstood." I reflected on Elspeth's voice echoing through the chapel, breaking the trance with a single verse. She had not argued with Ambrose. She had not threatened him. She had simply sung the truth, and the spell broke. "And the hymn?" I asked. "It's destroyed." Holmes nodded. Elspeth burned the original manuscripts. The last known copies were with Ambrose. Scotland Yard seized them, and I've ensured their ashes were scattered over the Thames this morning. "Then it's finished." He turned back to me with a glint in his eye. "A case is never finished, Watson. It merely finds its silence." The grandfather clock chimed the hour. Noon. The day had passed in reverie. Holmes moved to the writing desk and selected a fresh sheaf of parchment. "Will you write it up?" "Of course," I said, "though I dare say no one will believe it." He smiled faintly. "Then write it not for belief, but for remembrance." He paused, and then unexpectedly began to play. The first few notes were soft, hesitant, as though searching for footing. Then came a familiar progression, a phrase from the Raven hymn. But Holmes altered the rhythm, shifting from minor to major, rewriting the arc. The dissonance gave way to clarity. Despair to grace. It was no longer a hymn to the dead dot. It was a song for the living. I watched him until the final note dissolved into silence. And then, as always, I opened my journal and began to write not merely the facts, but the feeling, not the mystery, but the meaning dot. And in the music's wake, I understood Holmes had not merely solved a case. He had given a melody back its soul dot section. The shadow beneath the bell, the dampness of a London. Dusk lay heavy in the air as Holmes and I made our way once more toward Redhill Chapel. Though the constabulary had already secured the grounds and sealed off the nave, Holmes had secured a final hour of privacy through one of his customary favors owed by Scotland Yard. With lantern in hand and his coat buttoned high against the chill, he moved like a man drawn to some final reckoning. I followed in silence, my boots splashing in shallow puddles where the earlier rain had pooled dot as we approached. The chapel loomed darker than before, its crooked silhouette pressed starkly against the bruised indigo sky. I could not help but feel that we were descending into the very heart of the mystery, a place where memory, grief, and misused genius lay in tune together. Inside, the nave was quiet, but not dead. The pews, still scattered from the chaos of the night before, stood like silent sentinels. Holmes made for the pulpit without hesitation. He ran his fingers along the carved edge, then stooped to inspect the floor behind it. "There," he murmured, tapping lightly on a stone tile. "Listen, Watson." I knelt beside him and heard it. A hollow echo. "A hidden compartment?" I asked. He nodded. "I had my suspicions last night, but the chaos prevented a thorough search." With the butt of his cane, Holmes pressed on one of the surrounding tiles. With a faint groan, the stone shifted and revealed a narrow recess. Inside lay a small iron coffer, its surface rusted but still sound. He lifted it carefully and placed it atop the altar. With a few deft turns of his penknife, the latch clicked open, revealing a bundle of yellowed parchment tied in black ribbon. Holmes untied the ribbon slowly and spread the pages across the altar's stone surface. It was the Raven, hymn written in Henry Belgrave's own hand, but not the version we had heard. "This," Holmes whispered, eyes scanning the notes. "This is the original composition. Before Ambrose corrupted it." I leaned closer. The melody was there, but different, less somber, more tentative. The final bars trailed off into a delicate pianissimo. It ended not in darkness, but in uncertainty. "Do you see?" Holmes said. Henry never meant it to be a doctrine. It was a question, not a command. Ambrose twisted it into a divine answer, an absolute truth. But the original was open-ended, a man seeking comfort, not control. He gathered the pages, carefully refolding them into the coffer. "What will you do with it?" I asked. "Destroy it," he said flatly. "It no longer belongs in this world." We left the chapel by way of the vestry, where Holmes paused once more beneath the stained glass window depicting St. Cecilia, the patroness of music. Her eyes gazed downward in sorrowful serenity, as if she too had borne witness to the distortion of song and to tyranny. Outside, the fog was thick and pearled with moisture. As we turned back toward Baker Street, a figure emerged from the haze at the edge of the chapel gates. It was Elspeth Belgrave. She stood alone, her cloak pulled tightly about her. The gray of her hair caught the lantern light like silver thread. Holmes approached her without hesitation. "You returned," he said simply. "I had to," she replied, "to see that it was truly over." He studied her in silence. "You destroyed your copy of the hymn?" She nodded. "I burned it on the morning tide?" "Then you have done what your husband could not." Her voice quivered. "I loved him, Mr. Holmes, even in his silence. Even when the music grew too heavy to bear, I stayed until he began to vanish beneath the weight of his own creation." Holmes regarded her with an expression I had seen only a handful of times: compassion, tempered by clarity. "You did not fail him," he said. "You preserved his soul, even as others sought to claim his legacy." Elspeth looked down at her gloved hands. "Ambrose will never answer for what he did." "He will," Holmes replied, "but not in a court of law. The mind is a lonely prison, and he built his own." She glanced toward the chapel one final time. "I will not return here again." Holmes extended the coffer toward her. Then, "Take this. Let it rest with you until you are ready to release it, or not." She hesitated, then accepted it with both hands. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes." He dipped his head. "Farewell, Mrs. Belgrave." As she turned and vanished into the mist, I sensed a strange completeness settle over the chapel grounds, as though the land itself had exhaled after years of tension. Later that evening, back at Baker Street, we sat before the fire. Holmes finally took up his violin, drew the bow across its strings, and began to play not the Raven hymn, but a soft, anonymous waltz, a tune without a name, gentle and searching. As the melody filled the room, I thought again of Elspeth's letter, of Henry's grief, of the quiet strength it had taken to silence something beautiful when it had grown dangerous. After a long while, Holmes laid the instrument down. "It is over," I said. He nodded, but his eyes remained distant, and yet he murmured, "We shall never quite know how many hearts were changed by that song, how many minds turned for good or ill. Music leaves no fingerprints, Watson, only echoes." Outside, the fog lifted slightly. The city sighed beneath the hush of midnight bells, not ominous this time, but ordinary. Tomorrow would bring another case. But tonight we sat in the quiet aftermath of resolution, wrapped not in triumph, but understanding. Section. The last echo the following morning dawned gray and windless, as though London itself held its breath after the long and haunting melody of the previous days. Holmes stood at the window of 221B Baker Street, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes narrowed on nothing in particular. On the table behind him lay a letter, the final correspondence from Elspeth Belgrave, addressed not to Holmes, but to me. It was penned in graceful script, the ink uneven in places, as though blotted by tears. "Dear Dr. Watson, thank you for being a witness not to the mystery, but to the heart of it. My husband once told me that all sound like love is only felt when it fades. Now I understand what he meant. The coffer you gave me has been laid to rest where he once composed, beside the garden bench under the sycamore. It will not be exhumed, not by me nor anyone else. I hope Mr. Holmes forgives me for what I have withheld. I believe he already knows. Farewell." Elspeth. I had read it aloud only once, yet Holmes had not responded. He had merely nodded, as if confirming something already accepted. What did she withhold? I asked quietly. Holmes turned, pacing slowly toward the hearth, where the coals had burned down to ash. "She knew," he said. "From the beginning?" "Knew what?" "That Ambrose's obsession with the Raven hymn had begun years earlier than anyone suspected. Henry Belgrave's breakdown was not the cause of the hymn, it was its consequence." I frowned. "You believe Ambrose manipulated him?" "I believe he convinced Henry that divine inspiration required sacrifice. That true art could only arise from suffering. He planted that seed when Henry was vulnerable, perhaps grieving, or uncertain of his gifts. The hymn, as Ambrose interpreted it, became the very prison Elspeth described. Henry never recovered from it. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of parchment. It was a page I had not seen, part of the original Raven hymn, but annotated in a different hand. Margins were filled with phrases in Latin, notes of mathematical symmetry, and above all, the same recurring phrase scrawled in a loop, "Sacrum per dolorem," sanctity through suffering. "This is Ambrose's hand," Holmes said. "I found it hidden behind the panel in the chapel's vestry, slipped between two layers of wood. I studied the page, the obsessive markings, the warped symmetry. He didn't just believe the hymn was divine. He believed he had shaped it." "Precisely," Holmes said, "and it drove him to madness. The final murder, the curate, was not a cover-up. It was an offering. Ambrose believed he had to pay a final price to protect what he saw as a holy. Work. And Elspeth? She knew all along that Ambrose had influenced Henry. She knew that Henry's mind had been twisted not by genius, but by manipulation. Yet she said nothing. She chose to preserve what goodness she could, burning her copy, giving us the coffer, and ultimately walking away. She should have told us, I said, still struggling with the depth of it. Holmes shook his head. No, Watson, she should have done exactly what she did. The truth is not always a healing tonic. Sometimes it is a toxin we must dose sparingly. We sat in silence for some time. I lit my pipe and allowed myself the luxury of reflection on the music that had haunted us, on the chapel where madness had whispered beneath the stone, and on the woman who had loved her husband enough to silence his voice for the world's sake. Eventually, Holmes rose and donned his coat. There is one last thing, he said, one last place to visit before this case is truly closed. He led me to a modest cemetery just beyond Hampstead. The groundskeeper recognized him. Holmes's face had become notorious even among the dead, it seemed, and he allowed us in without question. We came to a modest grave, overgrown with moss, but unmistakably marked. Henry Belgrave, composer and son, 1852 to 1891. The sound endures. Holmes knelt and placed a small white lily on the stone. Then, reaching into his satchel, he removed a sheet of music. It was not the Raven hymn, but something else scrawled in Holmes's own neat hand. What is that? I asked. A variation, he replied. I took the original melody and corrected its descent into despair. Removed Ambrose's fingerprints, if you will. It's what I believe Henry might have written had he been free. He tucked the page beneath the edge of the headstone, securing it with the flower. When he stood, there was a lightness to his frame that I had not seen in days. Come, Watson. London waits. We departed the cemetery with the wind at our backs. The city, sprawling and indifferent, swallowed us once more into its maze of chimneys and whispers. Back at Baker Street that evening, Holmes finally took up his violin. Not with the urgency of revelation nor the melancholy of remembrance. He simply played. A slow waltz, no more than 20 bars, sweet and uncluttered. Is that from Belgrave? I asked. No, he said. It's mine. You've composed something? A fragment, he replied. A memory of what we heard. A promise that even in darkness, a truer song may rise. We sat together in the warm hush of the room. Outside, the gas lamps flickered in the fog, and the city exhaled another breath. Into the night, and though no one else might ever hear the music Holmes played, I would remember it always not for its perfection, but for what it left behind, just like Henry Belgrave, just like the Raven hymn, just like the truth.